Hello and welcome to yet another interesting conversation with interesting people from software development. I'm Alex Bolboaca. I'm coming to you from the Mozaic Works studios. And today my guest is a professional dancer, a musician, a storyteller, but he's also a programmer, agile coach, trainer, community leader, and I've learned in the past few minutes, software configuration manager. So this is a whole story that I'd like to explore with my guest. Welcome, Erik Talboom.
Thank you. It's good to be here.
So first of all, I'd like to start from my first question is usually about what drove you to programming? How did you get to programming, especially with your background in all these artistical endeavors, let's say?
Well, it was a kind of a two-step program. When I was about 9, I got my first programming book from my oldest brother, who was studying civil engineering, and it was programming in C. It really scared me, but I was able to do some small things with that, and then I thought, yeah, no, I don't want to do this. So when I started studying, getting closer to university, I thought I want to work with people or with animals. So after 2 years of trying that, I figured out that I was still I just didn't like the whole system administration thing, not so much. So after studying that for about a year, I turned out to be rather good at programming. It was one of the few exams that I aced like 100% out of 100 out of 100. So I thought maybe I should give this a real chance. First, I became a teacher. Then I said I couldn't really teach programming if I haven't really done it myself. And 6 months later, I started my first full-time development project, which was for the Flemish government. Ever since, there's been a developer in my heart. Also in the years that I wasn't really developing a lot, it was still whispering in my ear, we want to do things, we want to create things. So I think last year, just after COVID hit, I chose to go 100% back into software development. But from my angle, which is not the typical feature development angle. But I can tell you more about that later.
All right, so just to go back a little bit, I think you met first with Adi, my brother, in Belgium, and you started organizing code retreats. Can you tell something about how that happened and how the community was at the beginning?
Absolutely. We started out, that was about 11 years ago, I believe, that we organized the first code retreat in Belgium with Corey Haynes, still running the show. And that was so inspiring, getting people. I had never done pair programming myself before, and I had never really encountered the concept of deliberate practice in that way. So a lot of people in the community, a lot of the first time registrants, they really wanted to come back. So I said, okay, you know what? If Corey can do this, it's a little bit like Pippi Longstockings. I've never done this myself, so it's probably a good idea if I do it. So I tried that, and the first code retreat was a huge success. There were in total 4 people. Me, Adi, Wouter, and I don't know who the 4th one was. I think Bart. So that's how I got introduced to Adi, and he actually had some experience with running days. So that was very, very useful because I really had no idea or no structure, nothing. There was not even a website about code retreats. It was just winging it. And he had so many really annoying questions about software design that I thought I need to keep this guy close. So I think we spent about 3 years running code retreats in Belgium, going from 4 to 14 to 24 participants on average, always around 16 to 18. We went abroad. We went to the Netherlands. I didn't go with him to France because that's scary. My French is not in a, let's say, operating state to run events on. But we did quite a few of those. We also did one in England. And it was pretty cool. And I think Adi stayed is one of my technical mentors for about 6 years, until I kind of dropped out of development most of the time and went into pure full-time agile coaching. But the community continued growing. We kept doing those events, and about 8 years ago or 7 years ago, we changed the name to actually match with the event that started in Germany, Socrates. So now it's Socrates Belgium. It's also the event, the monthly events. It's not just the unconference. And we have about 250 active members right now. And from time to time, there's a request for a code retreat, but yeah, given that everything is still remote, there's not been a lot of requests for that. Everyone is waiting until they can do it face to face again, but I guess we'll be waiting just a little bit more.
And so I like to, since the code retreats are a transformative event for many people who participate, but you have to be there to go through the transformation, and actually not as many people go to these events. How did code retreats inform your career? Did you change anything because of code retreats or because of the interactions there?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, it's the one and only book that I know of where I'm mentioned in the foreword, being thanked for bringing it to Europe together with Adi. So that's pretty cool. It also gave me a structure to think about. Okay, I already knew a lot of things about software design that were not the same as the people I was typically working with. There were a lot of things around test automation, around simple object calisthenics, how to design code in a way that it's usable for you as a software engineer, a software developer. And honestly, I felt a little bit like I was the only one in the teams that I was working with. So probably there's something wrong with me, until I met that community around the code retreat and I saw, hey, wait a minute. I'm not the only one with these weird ideas, and these weird ideas seem to actually work in other companies. So I started looking for those, and I actually created a blacklist. So I would interview companies instead of they would interview me. And there were a couple of no-goes. If there's no test automation, if there's no unit testing at all, yeah, we don't even need to continue the interview. That would be one of my first questions. Do you do some kind of test automation? If so, can you show me? And if that was not in place, I would just not bother. And I realized about 10 years ago that most software companies or companies that were doing software development in Belgium that I encountered were still in this phase of, wait, we're going to write code to verify the behavior of other code? That's too expensive. That doesn't make any sense. It's going to cost us too much time. So I switched. Instead of kind of making my own life or my team's life better, I said, okay, let's go into this whole agile coaching thing, because I believe agile, XP, whatever you want to call it, Scrum or whatever, it's all about, finding better ways, uncovering better ways to develop software. And test automation is part of that. And a kind of a usable software design for sure. Otherwise, you cannot do decent test automation. It will just become painful. So that kind of shifted me into, let's first help organizations figure out that this is the way to go, and then lay the technical foundation once the path is a little bit cleared. The problem was that for a lot of our clients, it ended at that first path, and they kept on using the same technical practices as before. That was for a couple of years. So what was cool that the last 3 or 4 years, I started feeling a shift. I've been mostly working Belgium, Netherlands, and with a client there. And I started feeling this shift where people no longer needed to be convinced about test automation. They were more like, okay, can you help us figure out how to do that better, and how we can introduce that on this monster of a legacy code base that we have? And that's still thinking back of when Adi and I redesigned the legacy code retreat to make it more like a storyline. That is one of my absolute favorite workshop types to run still. And I've been able to help, I don't know, a few dozen teams with really digging into things that they were really scared of and going like, it's not that scary. Let's start small and let's build up. So it had a huge impact on kind of my self-confidence as a software crafter, and got me introduced to the whole software craftsmanship community and concept. So, and it also made me kind of go back last year to my technical roots.
Yeah, so this leads me to a few interesting topics related to these techniques that we talk about in the software craft and that you can practice during code retreats. Techniques like refactoring, writing tests, test-driven development, pair programming. And most of these techniques, they are difficult to get because they are weird. They are weird for the way we are taught as programmers, right? And I notice often that companies, as you mentioned, have a hard time figuring out what would be their value. So what was your experience initially? Why would people not accept these techniques, or why would people say no to them? Just because it was a lot of work, or because there was something else?
I think honestly that it's mostly a human psychology thing. If you have people who have been programming for 20, 25 years sometimes, yeah, they cannot stand that there's like a 30-year-old guy coming over and going like, I can make your life a lot easier and make your code better at the same time. And they're going like, no, no, no. We should have figured this out by now on our own, right? I ran a lot of experiments. And the biggest thing is, yes, especially when we did the code retreat without retreat, so only focusing on code, like different design patterns, different ways of looking at designing software. Then typically the excuse being used, the justification was, oh yeah, when we do it greenfield, when we start from nothing, yeah sure, then we can do this, and then we can build high quality code. But we have something to start from, and we don't know how to deal with that. So the jump from, yes, we like this idea, to how are we going to do this at home, in our own code base? That was the biggest excuse, the biggest challenge for a lot of teams. That's why I also at some point said, I'm not going to do another code retreat with any company, with any team, before doing so. I first do a legacy code retreat. I first teach them very simple. We go through a couple of very, very simple refactoring techniques, like just renaming things. That is already, for a lot of people, that is mind blowing. It's like, hey, wait, is this already improving code quality? Yes, of course. And that kind of lowers the barrier to go like, oh wait, if we can already do a couple of these small things, yeah, okay, and then we split out the different things a little bit more instead of having like functions of 800 lines. We split them out a little bit. And then that little thingy, there we can write a test, right? Right, yeah. So it's really the fact that people need like a story to follow. If you give them the standard code retreat format, I still love that, and I still do that also now with companies. I just got a request yesterday for that, for another set of code retreats. But it's more of a tasting in a way. It's kind of like a menu. You have a couple of tapas. We could do this, we could do that, we could do this. You could do TDD as if you meant it, which is really scary still for a lot of people, really scary. And then they go like, yeah, okay, but what are we supposed to do with our actual code base now? And there you go, okay, don't worry. We have like a 7-course meal for you. We have it planned out. We just go step by step. And even though people typically break the rules by doing more than they're allowed in that specific session, they really love the fact that there's an external structure to keep them disciplined.
Yeah. And you mentioned the legacy code retreats, which you had an influence on. And I have to say, I attended legacy code retreat. I think it was in Ghent right? When you facilitated, and it was really cool. Particularly the session on using static functions. That was very cool. Can you tell a bit more about legacy code retreats and why did you find them so interesting? They got where they are now?
Yeah. So we started the first one with JB Rainsberger. I think we had like the third ever globally in Belgium. We were a little bit faster to the show this time than with Corey's initial code retreat. I think there we were like 40th or something worldwide. But with the legacy code retreat, I remember both Adi and I were there participating, and we both had this feeling like, no, it's not entirely, it's a good first run, and people needed it. People were asking for this for 2 years. We want something to start from an existing code base and to improve that. So what we started doing is like, okay, so what do we typically do? We really investigated, what do we do when we encounter a new code base? How would we approach it? And what are the smallest, safest changes that we can introduce? The safest thing is not change anything at all. Then you're not going to break the system, for sure. What is the next step? So the first step is we typically have a little bit of a reading exercise just to see how do people actually go about investigating a new code base. That's already an eye-opener for a lot of people. And then the next one is just really simply renaming certain things. Typically, if you're in a statically typed language with an IDE, that is very, very safe still, especially when you're using refactoring tools that are built in. It's a 99 point something. I don't know what something, but 99 point something % safety. And that typically is, for a lot of people, that the biggest eye-opener in that is they get to understand more about the code. They get to test their assumptions with their pair before they start changing conditionals and cutting up functions into smaller functions and all that jazz, which is beautiful, and you want to get there, but that's not your first step because you're breaking your code base. And it happens every single time, almost every legacy code retreat that I run. People jump the gun, then go like, oh damn. Because then I ask, have you ran it? Have you tested the output again? And they run it and they go like, damn, it doesn't work anymore. Go back. Take it really, really, really slow. No one is there. There's no like traditional 90s project managers behind you going like, have you renamed that variable yet? Don't worry about it. We've got the time to do this. And then we typically, what happened with Koen Metsu, my co-founder of the Socrates Belgium Unconference, and now also co-community leader of the Socrates Belgium community still up to today, we started creating like forks in the path. We had one path for about 2 or 3 years, and then we started thinking, okay, but what if we want to do something different? Instead of going, the one that you followed was more the standard path, from renaming, refactoring, introducing the golden master, which people are understanding more and more nowadays, to conditionals, to pure functions, to extracting classes. We said, what if we want to turn it around a little bit, and instead of really trying to cover the entire tree or from the API outward in, what if we want to test inward out? What if we want to take a little piece of the code, extract it, bring that under test without bringing the entire branch or the entire tree up there, which we had a really cool name for that. We didn't do any marketing, so maybe now it's going to be launched for real. We called it sniper testing. So we coined that term about 2 years ago, so you probably never heard of it. We're not good at marketing. But to really zoom in on one particular part of the code, extract that, bring that under unit test, and forget about all the dependencies outside of that, which is, we typically also do that by using pure functions, because that's the easiest way to transport something out of an existing function. And we've done a couple of those experiments. We had another path, but we never really brought that to production, so I also forgot about it. That's okay. But it's what I notice is that most people go like, yeah, I've heard of this before, and I've done this before. Yet they haven't really practiced it. It's not in their muscle memory. And these kind of sessions, these legacy code retreats really helps them with getting it into their muscle memory and going, okay, and getting that structure in. So that's what how it evolved over the last few years.
All right, that's very interesting. So actually, I worked in the past year or so on a technique that sounds very similar to this, which I called surgical refactoring of legacy code. And it starts by, I've done some codecasts in C++. It starts by making functions pure, so fundamentally extracting pure functions from existing functions, because in that way you have all the dependencies outside. And move these functions someplace else, and then you can test them using things like data-driven tests or property-based tests, and then you can regroup them into classes if you really want to, or you can go to a more functional design if you prefer. And the reason this works amazingly well in C++ is because you have very strong support for constants. So you can say something is constant, the compiler will tell you that, you know, this function is changing it, or so on. And so it's much easier to surface dependencies. But on the other hand, it's much harder to recombine the functions together, because the refactoring support for C++, because it's such a complex language, is not that good, especially for things like moving functions or stuff like that.
Yeah.
So that's interesting. It sounds very, very similar.
Yeah, absolutely. Great minds,
right. You know. Yeah. So I think the last time, well, the first time we met, I think it was for an ITACON conference. And then we've also met for some various other conferences. One thing that I noticed when you are at a conference, you tend to gather a group of people who listen to your stories. So how do you do that?
That's a good question. I do still remember the ITAC together with Sandro Mancuso from Codurance, where I think it was Adi who introduced a new role in the open space. So you have typically the bumblebee, and you have the butterfly, and now he introduced the concept of the flower. So wherever Sandro or I went, we always had a gathering, pretty much half of the crowd listening to us. Even if the topic was not ours, we kind of contributed to the story that was ongoing. For me, I think that there's one thing that I've gotten feedback on from a lot of people is my openness and my willingness to share my own mistakes, my own failures, my own learnings, my own ignorance and stubbornness sometimes. But also bringing like the reality, like it is not easy. If you have a code base that has been, you know, tinkered with, created over the last 10 years, and it was not designed for any kind of test automation, it was not really designed deliberately at all, yeah, you're not going to change that in 2 weeks. You're not going to change that in 2 months. But the concept of kind of what you see is what you get. I'm very open when I tell my stories, and that kind of draws people in. I'm not afraid to go into a confrontation with someone and have a difference of opinion. That helps also. I'm also 1.94 meters, so I literally stand out a little bit, but I don't think that is a huge impact because Sandro, for instance, is not that tall, and he also has the same impact on people. I don't know. I think I bring some kind of hope to people when they listen to my stories. They go like, "Hey, wait a minute! If that guy was able to do that in like this country that no one has ever heard of, like Belgium, I don't know, what is that? Is that a city in Brussels or something, or a part of a suburb or something? So they go, if they can do it in Belgium, then maybe we can do it in our code base as well. Also, sometimes it helps when I talk about Belgian beer, because that's the one thing that everyone knows about from Belgium. So that does help from time to time. I think it's mostly the hope that people feel like I'm not a genius. I'm definitely also not the smartest, not at all the smartest software crafter in the world. Absolutely not. But I've got this down to earth approach to designing software, and I'm pretty good at that. But you don't need to be part of the 1 or 5 or even 10% to be able to do a decent software design. And I think that is what draws people in. And just a normal guy being able to do this. So gives them the opportunity to say, we can do it then as well.
So what do you use for designing software? As principles or as techniques that you can share?
Well, one thing definitely, the 4 elements of simple design that were introduced to me on the first code retreat with Corey Haynes, they have been a guiding factor in everything I do, because I don't reproduce. It's really difficult for me to just cognitively reproduce interesting information. So like memorizing things, it's never been one of my strengths. So 4 principles that I can master, that works. And it just comes down to keeping things simple, right? Making sure that you have some kind of automated tests. It doesn't talk about test coverage, but it does say that somehow you need to have an automatic feedback loop. However you implement that, there's easy and there's harder ways, and there's ways that give more or less feedback. I love the strict, like the deliberateness of your naming conventions, of your, how you name things. I know that I went to a DDD course, domain-driven design course, at some point in the UK, in London, of course, with Skills Matter, and like the only thing I got of that is like, yeah, okay, that's the second element of simple design. Name things the way they really are in the real world. Cool, ubiquitous language. There, I saw posts after post after post about that and how difficult people found it. It's like, when you're building a game of chess and you give names to your moves, or you give names to whatever element, whatever component exists in there, it needs to be from the domain of chess. So whoever plays chess should be able to read your code, at least to some level. That was, 10 years ago, that was very not trivial, apparently. People did not really fully understand that. But I think that's been the main guiding principle, is to rename things, to make sure that the naming actually is so explicit that anyone could read it. And that typically surfaces the 3rd element of simple design, of duplication. If you make your names very deliberate, very intentional, you will see, hey, wait a minute, we have the same concept here a few times, so why do we do that? I used to say, especially when I was still teaching, that the ultimate goal of a developer is to be as lazy as humanly possible. So why would you write the same concept twice? You have to maintain it twice. You have to write unit tests for it twice. Write documentation or generate documentation for it twice, etc. Don't do that. If you can do it once, why do it twice? The 4th element of simple design is one that has never really, I don't know, I've always found it difficult to explain to people, like, has fewer elements. What does that even mean? I just interpret it in the way like, do the absolute minimum you can to fulfill this request. That's how, keeping things simple as possible. I think that's really what I keep in mind most of the time when I'm creating any kind of, designing any kind of system, is these 4 building blocks. All the rest, when these are applied, I've been able to kind of create, while doing it, create certain design patterns without even knowing it. At some point going like, hey, wait a minute, that's a factory pattern. we just came up with using a factory pattern in this situation just by using the 4 elements of simple design. That was pretty cool.
Yeah,
so there's no magic to it.
But it's very interesting that these four rules, when you read them, they are short, like, right? They are very short. It sounds like you cannot possibly get all the, I don't know how many hundreds of pages were written about software design, thousands, tens of thousands out of these rules. And yet it's incredible the generative power they have. As you mentioned, by following these rules, they kind of feed on one another. So first of all, if you name things properly, then you'll notice duplication, then you'll remove some duplication and so on. So that's one simple one. And then by doing that, you get to design patterns. You get to, and I often tell people, most of the features that you have in programming languages, the code constructs, are there because there was a need to remove some type of duplication.
Yeah, good point. That's true.
You think about like variables. Why do you need variables? I mean, you could have numbers and just add to numbers stuff and just keep at it, but then you'd have to write those numbers again and again and again. And why do you have things like functions? Because why write again the same code and again and again and again?
That's true.
And classes are kind of the same idea. They are a bit more than that, but it's also a way to remove duplication. So it's incredible how far you can go with these rules and how much you can generate. But it's still, I guess it's very weird to imagine that this is possible, and unless you experience it by applying test-driven development in the right way and with these principles, I don't think it's very possible. By the way, you mentioned earlier TDD as if you mean it, and that's a weird.
Don't ask me
session.
To explain it, huh?
Yeah, no, we will not explain it. I can explain it briefly. It's the most restrictive variant of test-driven development, and its purpose is not necessarily to use in production, although there are some people who do that. But its purpose, from my point of view, is more to learn how code actually evolves when you're doing test-driven development, to see the dynamics of evolution. So what you mentioned that it's still difficult for people to do that.
Yeah.
What do you think is the biggest challenge?
I think it's the one technique that I've seen. I think there's two techniques that I've seen within using the code retreat and the legacy code retreat and everything I've done since then. There are two techniques that people go like, and that's TDD as if you meant it, and are taking baby steps, where that Adi and I created, where we basically force people to revert their changes if they don't get a test to pass within a certain time box, typically 2 minutes. People go insane about that one. But with TDD as if you meant it, I think it's the furthest from what is still taught in universities and polytechnical universities and any kind of applied computer science. You first start, and it's still being taught. I know because I still do some teaching at university, and it's still being taught. The first thing you do is you make a design, you come up with the different data, sometimes the different objects in your domain, but typically not. Typically what you start off with is which are the tables that you're going to store in your SQL database. And then from there you design your software. That is just not how real life works. That's something I've gotten from the DDD community, the concept that data is just a byproduct. It's not the main purpose. The main purpose is behavior. I think it took me 2 years and a lot of time with Adi to actually get that, and a lot of conversations with you as well. So like, okay, but what does that mean? That behavior is the main driver. That's the main thing. And data is just something that's a byproduct. but it scares people. It's so far from what they're used to. If you say, okay, but you want to have a certain behavior, all right, cool, write a test for it and implement that behavior within that test function. And you can see them go like, what? Yeah, but no, I'm going to create a separate class, right? No, you're not. Yeah, but a separate function that I can call. No, especially when you're writing the second test. If you can get them to a point where they write their first behavior in their first test, then they need to leave it there because there's no duplication. Then they need to write their second test, and they need to do the same thing, the same implementation within that second test. Slightly different, probably, but. And then they go like, and then you can feel them like, can we now finally create a function for this? Yes, in a separate class. No, still not. You first put it in the test class. And I've done sessions of like an hour and a half, where the only thing we had was a test class. Mm-hmm. The cool thing is that you can really reason and experiment with behavior without having to worry about which objects and what behavior goes where, because no one tends to agree on that. People see relationships between objects as inherent behavior of a certain object. No, not necessarily. It's not the best solution. But when you're just designing something where at the starting point, don't assume that you know what kind of actors or what kind of objects are in play. So it's challenging for people. What I found very surprising last year when I did a couple of these sessions is those were the ones, again, 10, 7 years ago, 6 years ago, when we're still doing them a lot in the community. It was the one session that people went like, oh, no, it's just too far. My brain melted. I want to go home. Now it's the one that is coming up in the feedback rounds at the end of a session going like, hey, wait a minute. I think I'm starting to get it. I think yeah. And people actually start using this in production, especially when they go like, we want to change something, we want to add something to the system, and we don't really know where yet. Then just add it in your test and then figure out it. The test will tell you where it kind of belongs. And then if it's designed already in that way, it's easy to move things around. And they don't need to be pure functions like we talked about. They don't need to stay pure functions at the end, also not. But it does make it, yeah. I have seen the evolution in people's way of thinking that, oh, it is starting to make sense, but it's still very far from what they're used to.
Yeah, and I think one of my theories is that we learn too much and we focus too much on the statics of code. Like, how does code look like? How, do you use tabs or spaces? Those kinds of conversations, which are mostly about the static things about code. But there are two types of dynamics for code. One is how it behaves when executed, which is where tests come in. And the second one is how the code evolves in time, which is fundamentally what we play with when we do test-driven development and what we control. And you mentioned that I just want to throw an idea to the audience. You mentioned that data is a byproduct often for for design. The interesting thing here is many of the programming languages that we use today, we interpret them as being class-oriented and not necessarily object-oriented. One very interesting conversation I had with Rebecca Worsbrook was that in Smalltalk you had kind of a universe that sparked up where you had the objects that were living, and you're basically playing with that universe by adding your new object and interacting with those existing ones. And this is something we lost. We don't have a live universe of objects that are around there. You have a bunch of classes and you look at the classes. And this is the fundamental difference, I think, which is very, very important, but very hard to get unless you've experienced it. It's quite interesting. All right, so one thing that you liked to talk about, since we were discussing conferences and people who are gathering around you, was about personal responsibility. Um, and this is a very interesting topic because I've learned more and more about responsibility in the past years, and it seems that it also drives more happiness in a way, which is quite weird. You wouldn't expect that if you get more responsibility, you will get happier about your place in the world and so on, but it seems to be psychologically, it seems to be the case. So what have you noticed with responsibility for programmers, for developers, and not only for development teams? What were you talking about with them related to responsibility?
I think I started introducing the responsibility process, which I won't go into too much detail on that one, but it basically, the basic concept of responsibility is that we stop being a victim of the situation that we are in. So we go, simplified, we go from, we don't really have a problem, right? You know, you have a code base that no one dares to touch. You can find new people that are willing to join your team because they're scared of your code base. There's no documentation anymore about what it's doing. No one knows because the person that was part of that already retired or whatever. So everyone's living in constant fear. So, but there's no problem until you need to change it. So when you no longer can deny that there is a problem, it's typically something or someone in the vicinity who created all of that mess. It's cool, you can do that. It's not going to get you an inch further. It's not going to solve your problem. And I do notice that that is changing again over the last few years. But this is how I started introducing this and bringing this in every training I did, whether it was a facilitation training, whether it was a TDD training, whether it was a code retreat or a legacy code retreat. I would always take like 5 to 10 minutes to just introduce this concept, because it's kind of like, I'm going to give this is secret. This is like the silver bullet. Everyone's looking for the silver bullet. I'll give you the silver bullet. A few weeks ago, I was in the Tony Robbins seminar, you know, the $1 million man, well, the $1 billion man almost. Everything around life coaching, I can summarize in one sentence. As soon as a person feels at least to 1% that they can change something about the situation, they will. That's the only thing. The only trick about life coaching, so everyone who's listening or watching this, that's the simple trick to life coaching. So you can now, you know, don't spend your money on Udemy courses on life coaching. That's the one thing. If you can get people to feel, truly believe that they can change something, they will. And that's the whole thing about responsibility. Responsibility is not accountability. It's not something someone gives you. Responsibility means that you take ownership of what is already yours. I still remember reading Sandro Mancuso's book about the software craftsman. There was a beautiful chapter, I think it was one chapter, about taking ownership for your own career. You know, we hear a lot of software crafters out there going like, oh, but I don't get a resharper license from my boss, or I'm not allowed to go to training. Yeah. Well, that's justification. That is looking for the reason for something to be like that outside of yourself. But it's all about taking 100% ownership of your own life. That is like, if you can introduce people to this, it's a feeding ground. It really gets people to think, hey, wait a minute. So maybe I can actually write some unit tests, even though somewhere up in middle management, people go like, unit tests? No, we're not going to do that. You know, I bring this to everyone I talk to, because I believe that responsibility, how Christopher Avery brought it to the world over the last 2 decades now, he says it's responsibility is freedom, power, and choice. And like you said, responsibility is not taking on more obligations, more commitments. That would be part of the responsibility process, but you're not at responsibility yet. You're not taking ownership. You're just trying to please others. You're trying to do things that you don't want to do, but you think you should be doing because of other people and expectations of yourself. But it's typically responsibilities where you actually do what you want to do with full conviction, so with full freedom. That makes you a lot more creative. in how you solve things. I also believe that it is key to bring this to teams if you somehow want them to take up self-organization or self-management, two different things. You cannot just pour self-organization over teams and expect it to work, or just go like, we are not going to organize you anymore, go figure it out. No, if these people intrinsically still inside of them feel that they have to abide by the rules, they have to do certain things, and if they make a mistake they should be ashamed of themselves, they're not going to make any changes. So I remember in 2019, one of the coolest things we did over the last few years, we were working with a Czech company with about 100 people in a development department, working on one product, a big product. There were a lot of different software units and components and whatever, and there were some scary things in there. I only saw that afterwards, but we did like a 4-day boot camp on premise. Well, we did that in a hotel. We got 100 some people in a big room, and I got to do the opening keynote. And it was not about less. We were doing large-scale Scrum with them. We prepared for that for 9 months with management, with Scrum Masters, with team members, with technical leaders. Well, we didn't do a keynote on large-scale Scrum and what it looks like. We didn't do a keynote on the Agile Manifesto or whatever. I did a keynote on the responsibility process. And I asked them in the end, like, are you now everyone, are you really setting an intention on taking responsibility, your own ownership of your own environment and your own system? That was the feeding ground for the rest of the 4 days to actually create new teams, set up new technical practices. They completely redesigned the way they were going to do kind of like operational support of their product. And that was only, I believe it was not only possible, but it was a lot easier if you sit there, if you participate in that with a feeling of, hey, I get to choose how I design my life. So that's why, yeah, it's my biggest passion when talking to people, because I see so many people who are stuck in their own little victim, in their own little cage. And typically people create very small cages for themselves. You know, my job description, I remember years ago, my job description is a manual tester. So I'm not allowed to write any script to automate anything. I told the entire story just 2 weeks ago and it still hurts. Why do you do that to yourself? There's so much cool things happening in the world. There's so much possible with technology. Why do you let yourself be held prisoner? Because you believe that this is how you should interpret your job description. By the way, a job description that no one in your company actually has seen or read in the last 3 years. So I believe it is fundamental to get people to kind of move beyond their first being able to open up about what is holding them back right now, and then secondly to move forward from there. That's why I typically start any kind of workshop with that.
Yeah, so this just to share a bit of a story from my experience. I took over the Mozaic Works infrastructure, I think it was a few years ago. I don't even remember anymore. But the hardest thing for me in the beginning was to start spending money. Because until then I wasn't used to spending money to build something and fundamentally to take some risks, because it was about, okay, so we'll do WordPress and we need certain premium plugins, but what if that plugin is better than the other plugin, and so on. And it took me some time to figure out that, this is an intrinsic cost of learning. You need to try out different things. Sometimes you need to pay for those. But otherwise, you cannot advance. You cannot obtain the results that you want for you, for company, for whatever you want to do. So this is part of it. But it was quite strange to notice this about myself. I wouldn't have imagined it, because I spent for ReSharper, for example. I bought that for myself as a license when I was a programmer back, working for an outsourcing company who wouldn't buy these kinds of things, and I wanted to have it, and I thought, yeah, why not? I'm well paid. I can do that. It's not that large of an investment. But when it was for the company, it was different, because it was kind of more responsibility and so on. But now I understand this better. So it helped me to figure out how to build infrastructure for things that can be quite complex sometimes, like making sure we keep the costs low, but also that it works well, it scales well, and all those those weird things. So yeah, let me play a bit the devil's advocate, okay, with this, because I think you've had these conversations a lot, so it will probably be fun to do a bit of back and forth. So my manager doesn't send me to test-driven development courses. I'm a programmer, and I learned about this, but I want to learn, but they are not sending me to a course. They don't want to pay for it.
Yeah, cool. Do you really want to learn that?
Yeah, I mean, it sounds as an interesting technique. It's
okay. What do you hope to get out of it?
And I'm not sure. It looks like a technique that has gained momentum, or it's public, but I'm not sure if it's useful or not, or I don't have any arguments to convince anybody else that it's.
Well, it sounds like you're not fully convinced of the added value yourself. It's going to be difficult to get someone to pay for it then, right? So, can I poke you? Are you okay with being confronted?
Yeah.
Okay. So I can help you build like a sales argument for your manager. The problem is that you first need to be convinced that you really want it, that it's going to add it. You feel pain, right, on a daily basis when you're working with your code.
Yeah, it's especially other people's code. I don't understand it.
Yeah, that's always the word. Unless in 2 months it's your own code that you see. That happened to me typically when I go like, I'm gonna git blame someone. Who, which idiot wrote this piece? Oh, it was me. No, so what? So it hurts to work with code that is there already. Why does it hurt?
It's hard to understand, and then when it takes a while to find where to change things.
True. Yeah. So it's hard to find your way around it.
Comments are not always explaining what the code does, because. Yeah.
Oh no, but code comments, that's a code smeller. If you need to write a comment to explain your code, it means that your code is not describing itself. So maybe what we first need to look into is how can we reduce your pain? If you want someone else to pay for something, you really need to want it, and you really need to feel like this is going to somehow relieve some of your pain. If not, no one's going to pay for it. On the other hand, if you don't feel like building your argument, there's also another solution. Do you typically eat dinner?
Yeah.
On a daily basis?
No, not daily.
Okay. On the weekends sometimes?
Yes.
Does your manager cook for you?
No.
Yet you get to survive. You get to have dinner. It's your choice whether your manager decides which training you follow, or it can be your choice. I know a lot of these trainings are super expensive. So is a pair of Nike Air Jordans. So is a PlayStation 5. Maybe a training is not even the best solution. Have you tried joining like a software crafting community? You can get a gold mine of information without ever paying, just from people who are eager to teach others because they have felt the pain and they kind of made a hobby out of helping others to relieve their pain.
Right. So I'm smiling because I recognize this conversation, and it's really, really cool to to have it like this. Uh, that was fun.
That was a fun one. Yeah.
So now uh, I don't want to keep you very long. I know you have kids waiting, and we will need to stop soon.
The house is not burning yet, so I think we're safe.
But a few things you mentioned in the beginning, before we started, that you are now working as a software configuration manager.
Yeah.
And so this is something new, and I think that it would be interesting to hear a bit about what you do all day.
It was honestly when I started. So last year when COVID hit, I had a couple of agile coaching clients, but I had already for a few months this feeling of, I'm going to be very blunt. Sorry if this offends anyone, but I was done explaining Scrum rules to people because we are anniversary of Scrum, I think. I didn't want to do it anymore. So I felt like I wanted to do something else. And with COVID actually hitting, and in Belgium, remote coaching was not a thing. It was really not a thing. So everything paused. So I went like, okay, but I want to do something and I want to make a living. So a friend of mine got his manager to call me for about an hour. I think a week later, I was hired as a software configuration manager. Honestly, I was not really sure what a software configuration manager would do all day. I said, you know what? It's about infrastructure a bit. It's about helping the team to do test automation and helping them to take things away from the team so they can develop features. So I can do that, whatever it is. So it started out, I thought it was going to be more of an administrative role, let's say, security protocols and policies and whatever. The cool thing, it's a medical startup, so we're not really that big, and our software department is huge. We're right now 9 people because we're building, our main product is not software. We are building an app to support the actual hardware, but it's not really that big of a deal. But what I found is that there was an entire list of things that this team wanted done, but didn't really feel passionate about doing. The cool thing, in the end of my full-time professional career as developer a few years ago, I already didn't like building new features. That was not my main driver. I always enjoyed like the animation on the side, refactoring certain things, simplifying certain designs, coming up with a different idea of doing infrastructure for certain things. Helped a couple of teams with containerizing certain elements, certain components of their architecture. And this is mainly what I do now on a daily basis. There's some, can you create another Jira user for this new employee? Yeah, sure. It's part of it. But it's mostly kind of developing internal tools and libraries that make life easier for the firmware developers who are working in embedded C, or the mobile developers who are working in Swift in iOS. Helping our one test engineer to make it that he can still survive. He's brilliant. It's a brilliant guy because it's one guy and we have 6 different technologies just in this little world. And he keeps an overview of all of that. And every day it goes like, hey, but did you think about this? No. No, we didn't. Okay, let's add that. So what I do is a lot of, so we have a couple of small tools like an HTTP server with some, that is kind of an HTTP endpoint for a serial communication to our hardware, which is linked to our continuous integration setup. I do a lot of work on the continuous integration setup itself, help out the electric engine. We have one electronics engineer, who is also doing a lot of electronics and mechanical testing on our hardware. So I helped him to set that up on our Jenkins system. Yes, a Jenkins. For all you Jenkins haters out there, yes, it is. So I do a lot of that on a daily basis, doing like a resource pool of all of our hardware so that our pipelines, a Jenkins pipeline is, as of the last few years, it's also code. It's still something that people do not consider code. So it looks horrible. It looks like your, my first C program that I wrote when I was 9, full of duplication and full of just things that don't belong there. So I do a lot of work on that. And as part, because it's in a medical world, there's also, we need to validate our software. For anyone who has not been in a medical world or some kind of regulated world, it basically means that we need to somehow prove that the tools that we are using, that they are fit for purpose. And that could be, for instance, our own little HTTP server in Node.js that we spun up. We need to do a couple of we need to describe what the intended use is and how we validate that it actually does what it's supposed to do. And only for the actual medical software, the firmware that is going into the chip, that one needs to be, spit out, and that needs to be manhandled by an enormous battery of, I think right now, 1,200 tests every single time. So I do all of that, which means that I get to work in like 4 or 5 different technologies, from infrastructure, Docker, network monitoring, service monitoring, writing an HTTP server in Node.js, finding something wrong in an embedded C, so doing a small update on embedded C. I've done commits on every single component that we have in the system. And I think it's perfect for me because I've never been like a Node.js guy or a C# guy or a C++ guy. I've always been like, I kind of like to keep the overview, and I like to dabble in all of these things and find ways to make life easier for the development team. And that is now my job. I didn't know. If I had known that that is typically what a software configuration manager does, I don't think it is. But in these medical startups, it's often the time. Yeah, I probably would have switched to this earlier. And I've not done a lot of work. I've done a little bit of work in Swift, but since we're expanding our efforts and our test automation is not moving as fast as we would like it to. So I'm probably gonna dig into our mobile applications and find ways to improve the test automation there. So I'm gonna learn more about Swift. It's the ideal way to learn any kind of ecosystem, in my opinion. Ecosystem and tooling is to write tests on existing software. You don't need to figure out how data structures work and how all the different, you just start writing tests. And if you can make your tests in a decent way, then you start understanding the ecosystem because you start the libraries and everything. So this is how I started learning JavaScript a couple of years ago, by just code retreat sessions got us on writing more tests and more tests and more tests. And at some point you kind of figure out how it kind of works. And then JavaScript introduced promises. And now I'm a bit lost again. But
all right. This has been very, very interesting. And in the end, I usually did something different in the past, but first time we are premiering this today. I have a 6 questions questionnaire, which was inspired by Bertrand Pivot, I think is his name, who was interviewing actors for the Actor Guild, and he always ended with with a questionnaire. Those were more like spiritual questions, let's say. These are more in our domain. So let's try to do this. First question, what book did you like and would recommend?
Can I say why as well?
Yeah, sure.
Because it's not a software programming book, but I think it's a book everyone should read. It's called The Courage to be Disliked. I cannot give you the two authors because I don't remember them. It's two Japanese guys, but they describe the concept of Adlerian psychology. So we all know Freudian psychology, Jung psychology, but Adlerian psychology twisted everything around. And I started introducing that in softwarecraft community events as well, by introducing the concept of one of the main thing I got from that book, one of the main things is trauma does not exist. I'm not talking about physical trauma. When you get hit by a bus, there's physical trauma. But psychological trauma, without any physical, you can get physical trauma in your brain as well. But if there's no such thing as psychological trauma, which means whatever happened in the past is in the past. And I started porting this to software. There's no such thing. When people talk about technical debt, they don't talk about technical debt, they talk about technical trauma. And I say we deny technical trauma. Whatever happened in the past was in the past. That doesn't it doesn't decide how we behave in the present and in the future. So I would definitely recommend this one. It's painful because it's like the Matrix. It's the blue and the red pill. Once you read this one, it's getting more and more difficult again with the responsibility thing to kind of act like a victim. So I would definitely recommend this to everyone who is regularly using but we have so much technical debt that we cannot really do test automation or software design or split up domains and no. I would definitely recommend that one.
Yeah, this sounds very interesting because indeed I noticed that many developers are kind of in a limbo, and you can notice trauma as well and the effects of past happenstances on them. Second question, what book you didn't like and would not recommend?
Come on, ahead of you. Give me a second here. I read a lot of books over the course of a year. But one audiobook that I listened to a few weeks ago was recommended on a podcast by an Olympic champion, actually, going like, it's mind-blowing about taking ownership of your life. It was called The Obstacle is the Way, I think by Ryan Holiday. That was 4 hours of superficial information, in my opinion. I wanted to learn more about Stoicism because he's like a very strong champion of Stoicism. I think I learned more from listening to one podcast of Tim Ferriss about Stoicism than from this book, which is kind of like, when life throws you an obstacle or when you encounter an obstacle, life is not throwing this at you. Life is not aware of you. I don't believe that there's someone, playing a game with all of us. So when you encounter an obstacle, you can just sit down and go like, I cannot go further. Or you can work with it and you can use it to kind of accelerate. There, that was the book. Short version. I'll save you 4 hours of listening.
All right. Third question. Which topic do you think is not discussed enough in the industry or in communities or in the general software development community?
the expectation that we put on ourselves as a software crafter. That was one of the highlights, again, from Sandro Mancuso's book. He said, if a software crafter wants to get something done, even if they can take a full day to figure it out and to do it, they will still force them. They will still put this expectation on themselves to do it in 6 hours or in 4. And I think that is something that is not overly discussed. There's more than enough complaining about, what the system around them doesn't allow them and how there's so much external pressure on them. But what we're typically not talking about is the internal pressure, how much we force ourselves into things. And we self-criticize on this. And I think this is something that because of the whole agile movement of the last 20 years, when I was not developing, I would always ask the question, when people go like, oh, but we don't have time to write tests, or we don't have time to really think about our design or whatever. I go like, okay, who estimates your backlog items? Well, we do. Okay, who decides what goes into the sprint backlog and how much is enough? We do. Who then puts the pressure on you? Well, they do. Yeah, okay, let's try this again. Typically, after 3 times, they get it. We put, as software crafters, we put an enormous amount of pressure on ourselves, which I think, if that is something, I've seen this a couple of times in community events in Belgium where people would be transparent about that, and you would see the entire crowd become very, very kind of annoyed, like restless, but also going like, yeah, we recognize that. So I think that would be a topic that I would like to see more of.
Yeah,
so we can ease up a little bit.
And to add to this, as I mentioned, I have to spend some money to learn how to spend money, and some of those money were not well spent, and I had to write some code in order to learn how to write better code and so on, and that was not good code initially. So all these things are normal. These are part of, and I think it's a great message here. What topic do you think is discussed too much in the industry or community?
We are not allowed to. I'm going to give you 2 because I'm always a little bit of a rebel. But the main thing is justification and blaming. Like, we are not allowed to think, we're not allowed to do our thing, we're not allowed to do this, we're not allowed to do that. It's like, okay, right? I get that. If that is truly how you feel, you're not going to change anything. If I give you 7 options of what you could try and you all go like, oh no, we're going to, okay, either you stop complaining and you start talking about something interesting, or if you want to change something, you try something. It's probably going to fail, and that's okay. Like you said, it's learning, but at least try something. The second thing is what is the ideal CI server? Oh, what is the ideal anything, actually? I spent over the last 5 years in especially the Belgian community, every single time there was one topic about what is the best CI server, what is the best testing framework, what is the best this, what is the best that. And I also did that for my own home setup, my computers, and at some point you just go like, wait a minute. A, it doesn't exist. B, it doesn't even matter. You have something, you make it work. If it doesn't work, you change. And the whole, oh no, Jenkins versus Travis versus whatever, no, we need GitLab, we need, who cares? Own your tools and just make them work for you.
This reminds me of the company I worked for. They were discussing, they had a big meeting about a new project, and they had to decide on the technology to use for that project. And the decision was between, at that point, Visual Basic and C++. and they discussed for a few hours, and this was the entry points, and the exit was, we'll use Java. Just completely out of the blue. All right, fifth questions. What would be your ultimate career achievement? So something that after you do, you can say, okay, so I can retire now. I don't care anymore.
Oh, that's a really good one. It shifts, huh? But right now, I'm not going to be able to retire after this, but I really want to see this this medical product. Cannot share too much about it, but this we're in the area of diabetes, which is a huge problem in the world. I've dreamt about this since when I was 17. I wanted to be a civil engineer or some kind of thing. I want to have an impact on the medical world, because I think, we haven't progressed that far in the medical world over the last couple of decades, especially in traditional medicine. I don't want to get started in that one because that's going to take another half an hour. But if we can actually get this thing in production to really launch this so that people can use this, this will revolutionize every single diabetes person's life. To be able to be part of that, for me, that would, then I go like, all right, I can feel that right now. Like there's a couple of side initiatives that I'm doing, but that's my main thing, and I can really feel if this goes well, I have no clue what I'm going to do next time, because that is just to be able to contribute to the medical world in that way. That would be a really big achievement.
All right, and the last question: what advice would you give to a younger version of yourself?
It's something that I struggled with for 10 years. I remember I think it was the last physical Socrates Belgium, where at the closing, I said, we had there's this open sharing moment, and I shared that for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I had to prove myself to the community. I spent 10 years listening to dozens, hundreds of people around me saying, you cannot be good at software design and working with people. That's impossible. You need to choose. Either you become a really good agile coach, scrum master, whatever, or you become a really good software developer, software crafter. You cannot do both. You're going to do a little bit of everything, and everyone's going to make fun of you. And that, for 10 years, I heard everyone around me saying that you need to make a choice. You need to do one thing really good. Honestly, I'm glad I never really believed that. And I always kept both things kind of, it has shifted. But that is truly, when you feel something in your gut, it doesn't matter what anyone else says, just go for it. And this way, you can actually shift your focus. I don't believe in that. So I think that's the biggest, kind of like more a pat on the back of my younger self, going like, keep it up, keep believing that you can do both. Because in a way, it's not that different. But that's a story for another time.
Yeah. I mean, we have a video on this channel which talks about how programming is a fundamentally humanistic activity, that we program for people, both the code that we write and with people, and the products that we do. So that makes a lot of sense. Well, one last thing before we close. Is there anything else that you'd like to add for our audience?
One thing, because most people know me as Agile Coach over the last few years, and it's a fundamental thing that I've been saying for a decade now, and some people are picking it up. It's maybe not mine, but I'm going to say it anyway. if you do if you're still in the business of doing agile transformations, and most companies are still in there, and most companies, the really good ones, will stay in there for the rest of their lives because a transformation never ends. There's no end goal. Stop. No, not stop. The brain doesn't work with stop. If you do not change your technical practices, if you don't treat your technical practices as a first-class citizen, you're not going to get real change in your organization. You can set up whatever agile framework, and you can introduce 17 different roles and procedures and whatever. When you're writing code in a, pardon my French, shitty way, and you continue writing your code in a shitty way, the only thing that this whole agile thing on top of it, the agile sauce from a process point of view, is going to get, at best, more stress for everyone in the system. At worst, your best people are going to leave. So take technical ownership, technical practices, take that as a first-class citizen, as a high priority in whatever consideration you're doing. And change those together with your process, together with your organizational structure or whatever. But they go hand in hand. So you cannot change one without the other.
All right. It's been amazing, Erik. Where can people find you?
Well, my handle on most social media is Talboom Erik. So just my last name and my first name with a K, Erik with a K. Mm-hmm. In one thing. So you can find me on Facebook, on Twitter, on LinkedIn, on Gmail, actually. I used to say you can find me on my company website, but we decided to stop that activity just a few weeks ago. So if you type in Talboom Erik, you'll find a way to get to me somehow. And you can always get me to chat, get me to poke you on whether or not you're really stuck in your life or whether you can take ownership. And if you have some really bad code that everyone is scared of, you can always invite me to come and slay your dragon together with you.
Right. This has been an absolute pleasure, and I'd like to thank you for this interesting conversation, as always. So before we end, we have to pay our dues to the algorithm. So please like, share, subscribe, whatever you comment, do the stuff you need to do on YouTube, because other people who would like these kind of discussions, they will see them afterwards. That's how these algorithms work. And I'd like to thank you all for watching and for being part of this. We are coming back with even more interesting conversations. I'm really excited about some of the future ones, but you'll see them as they pop up in your timeline. So I'd like to thank you all for watching. Thank you all for being part of it. And until next time, remember to think, design, and work smart.